Mysterious UFOs seen by WWII airmen still unexplained. It was nearly the end of World War II. But for the airmen of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, it felt more like the beginning of War of the Worlds. Lieutenant Fred Ringwald was the first to see it. He was riding as observer in a night fighter piloted by Lieutenant Ted Schlueter, with Lieutenant Donald J. Meiers on radar. It was a late November evening in 1944, partly cloudy with a quarter moon. They were roaming the Rhine Valley just north of Strasbourg on the French-German border when Ringwald said, "I wonder what those lights are, over there in the hills," according to an American Legion magazine story on the sightings from 1945. There were 8 to 10 of them in a row, glowing fiery orange. Then Schlueter saw them off his right wing. They checked with a light ground radar, but they registered nothing. Thinking that the lights might be some kind of German air weapon, Schlueter turned the plane to fight, only to have the lights vanish. At first the men said nothing, fearing they'd be ostracized. But then the sightings spread through the unit. More crews, more sightings. On December 17, 1944, near Breisach, Germany, a pilot was flying at approximately 800 feet when he saw 5 or 6 flashing red and green lights in T-shape. The lights seemed to follow him, closing into about 8 o'clock and 1,000 feet before disappearing as inexplicably as they came. Then on December 22, 2 more flight crews sighted lights. One crew, near Hagenau, reported 2 lights in a large orange glow, seeming to rise from the earth to 10,000 feet, tailing the fighter for approximately 2 minutes. After that, the lights peel off and turn away, fly along level for a few minutes and then go out. They appeared to be under perfect control at all times, according to Keith Chester's Strange Company, Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II. And then there was Lieutenant Samuel A. Krasny's experience, a wingless cigar-shaped object, glowing red, just a few yards off the plane's wingtip. Lieutenant Krasny, justifiably spooked, instructed the pilot to attempt evasive maneuvers, but the glowing object stayed right next to the jet for several minutes before it flew off and disappeared. Eventually, the airman named the lights Foo Fighters, inspired by the comic strip Smokey Stover, in which Smokey, a firefighter, would often declare, "Where there's foo, there's fire." The combat fatigue explanation. An Associated Press reporter broke news of the Foo Fighters sightings on January 1, 1945, and theories about their origins quickly abounded. The sightings were flares, or weather balloons, or street Elmo's fire, a phenomenon where a light appears on the tips of objects in stormy weather. But the members of the 415th rejected all those theories. Flares and weather balloons can't track planes like these objects could, and they'd seen street Elmo's fire and could distinguish the two. Then there were those who claimed that the airmen were suffering from combat fatigue, a polite way of saying that war stress was driving them insane. But there was scant evidence to suggest collective psychosis. The 415th had an otherwise excellent record, and when a reporter for American Legion magazine went to report on the squadron, he described them as very normal airmen, whose primary interest was combat, and after that came pin-up girls, poker, donuts and the derivatives of the grape. Lieutenant Krasny's son, Keith Krasny, says his late father didn't fit the stereotypical profile of a UFO theorizer. In fact, he never even suggested that the glowing wingless cigar-like object that flew next to his plane was extraterrestrial in origin. He was very level-headed, very analytical, says Krasny of his father, adding that he kept a notebook where he wrote about, and drew, his Foo Fighters sighting. But although he never seemed prone to conspiracy theories, Krasny says his father was open to one. He entertained the idea that it could be late-breaking German technology. He did express the view that there were a lot of things during the war that were kept quiet. Was it the work of Nazi astrophysicists? Holding Nazi Germany responsible for the flying glowing orbs isn't too far-fetched. For one thing, the sightings took place over Nazi-occupied Europe, at a time when Germany's Luftwaffe was making tremendous strides. Then there's the fact that the sightings stopped once the German army was defeated. But the most compelling link to the Foo Fighters might be Wernher von Braun, a 32-year-old wunderkind rocket engineer. Von Braun helped the Nazis develop the V-2 rocket, a long-range guided ballistic missile that Hitler was using in 1944 against Belgium and other parts of Allied Europe. It's not too hard to imagine pilots, unfamiliar with long-range ballistics, comparing these rockets to a cigar-like wingless planes. The V-2 could even explain the glow, since its tail emitted a long burning plume. Nicholas Veronico, an author who has written several books on military aviation history, says that explanation comes up short. The V-2 rocket doesn't have the maneuverability, he says. It couldn't turn on a dime and change its acceleration pattern. Once it started burning, it burned and produced thrust at one rating. Nothing in Nazi Germany's military aviation arsenal can explain the Foo Fighter description, Veronico says. One airman's observation from the time, that the Foo Fighters follow the fighters so closely as to seem almost magnetized to them, is particularly confounding, given that there just wasn't the propulsion or metallurgical technology that could enable something like that. And yet Von Braun's career after World War II is worth considering. Following the collapse of the Third Reich, the engineer was recruited to be part of Operation Paperclip, a clandestine U.S. military program that spared 1,600 Nazi scientists prosecution for war crimes, moving them instead into the American military, where their past was whitewashed to the public. By 1952, Von Braun had reinvented himself as a spaceflight advocate, writing a piece that year in Collier's magazine declaring that within the next 10 or 15 years, the Earth will have a new companion in the skies, a man-made satellite that could be either the greatest force for peace ever devised, or one of the most terrible weapons of war, depending on who makes and controls it. His prediction proved overly conservative. The Soviets launched Sputnik 1 only 5 years later. Von Braun helped the U.S. Army launch Explorer 1 shortly thereafter. By 1960 he was with NASA, where he became the chief architect on Saturn V, the rocket that sent Neil Armstrong and the Apollo 11 crew to the Moon. As Von Braun recast himself as an American patriot, his career in the Nazi Party shadowed him, an ambiguous secret that reporters would playfully poke at. At one press conference before one Apollo launch, a reporter asked Von Braun to assure the press that the rocket wouldn't hit London. But they could never prove his involvement, and it was only in 1985, several years after Von Braun's death, that CNN broke news of the full extent of the aerospace engineer's Nazi past, more than 40 years after the fact. Veronico hopes the Foo Fighter narrative will follow a similar trajectory. The fantasy is that 100 years after the war, the US or Soviets will release information about what they captured, and it will blow all our minds. But I think they would have capitalized on it by this point, the historian says. Or weaponized it.